Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for coming to the Employee and Family Resources webinar today to learn more about neurodiversity. My name is Gina Brown and I'm an EFR trainer as well as an entrepreneur with a business focusing on innovation and leadership through the lens of neurodiversity. My passion for neurodiversity is twofold. First is my ADHD diagnosis in 2020. As I navigated the struggles that I experienced, I realized that I can share strategies and help others who are also neurodiverse. In addition, I realized the immense impact that leadership has on the employee experience, especially for those in the neurodiverse community. Lack of understanding is one of the most detrimental barriers in the workplace. And by spreading information and education about what it is, I want to show the incredible impact that people who are neurodiverse can have when they're in the right environment and can thrive. Although some may not realize it, innovation, leadership, and neurodiversity are actually very interrelated and connected. And when leaders understand how to leverage neurodiversity, it can drive innovation in an organization, leading to some really amazing transformations. So this morning we have a lot to cover in a very short amount of time. So we'll go ahead and dig right in. So to start us off, I want to actually share a few terms to make sure that we all know what I mean when I say these words. So we're going to start with neurotypical. Neurotypical refers to someone whose brain is standard or operates typically as society expects them to be. Neurodiversity, on the other hand, represents brain differences, how we think differently. And it actually comes from a movement that started in the 90s advocating that there is not a right way to think, learn, or behave, and differences are not deficits, but rather strengths to be leveraged. There are several diagnoses that fall under the umbrella of neurodiversity, and so this is actually just a very brief sample of some of the common conditions considered neurodiverse. Unfortunately, many of these are misunderstood. They still have a lot of stigma attached to them, which enhances some of the challenges that people may experience. But about 20% of the population is neurodiverse, so that's 1 in 5 people, so it's pretty significant. But for today's webinar, we're actually just going to focus on ADHD, dyslexia, and autism spectrum disorder. These are all neurobiological, meaning it's the biological makeup of how their brain was created, just like the color of hair or eye color or anything that's biological. Please keep in mind that as we talk through this first part of today's webinar, this is to help you understand some of the challenges. We're actually going to walk through these from a diagnosis standpoint under the medical model, which assumes that there's a cause and therefore a treatment for issues that a patient is experiencing. And so the focus is actually on the disorder aspect of it. The disorder could be defined as these set of problems which are causing significant difficulties or distress, impairment, or suffering in a person's daily life. So in order to build awareness, it's really important to actually understand some of these challenges, but keep in mind that there are a lot of strengths to be leveraged as well, and we will get to those shortly. So we're going to start with ADHD. It is a scientifically proven neurobiological neurodevelopmental disorder which can affect all areas of a person's life. ADD, ADHD, they're the same condition. The name was actually changed in 1987 from attention deficit disorder to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but they're still used interchangeably today. There are actually 3 types that fall under ADHD. It's inattentive, hyperactive, and combined type, which is both inattentive and hyperactive. Unfortunately, ADHD is not the greatest name as it's somewhat misrepresentative. It's not a deficit of attention, rather an abundance of attention that is misdirected in many different ways. It's chronic. It can be one of the most impairing psychological disorders, but it is also one of the most manageable. People experience issues on a spectrum, so a continuum, so therefore symptoms can really vary from person to person, and they can be mild or they can be severe. And some may experience challenges that they would align more with feeling scatterbrained, while others may experience challenges that are far more debilitating. It's estimated that as many as 553 million people have ADHD worldwide. I also noted here on the slide that upwards of 25% people actually experience the symptoms of ADHD, meaning that they have many of the same challenges that they're dealing with on a regular basis, but they may not actually meet the diagnostic criteria. But chances are good that someone on your team has ADHD and they may not even know it. And if they do know it, there's a high likelihood that they will not tell you due to the stigma that people experience when they disclose. So why is all of this important? Well, because ADHD is the most prevalent and most common neurological disorder amongst all of the disorders, but adult women are actually getting diagnosed at higher rates currently because for many of them, their symptoms went unrecognized as kids. That was my case. Naughty, disruptive little boys are usually pinned for those with ADHD, not the girls who were daydreamers off into their own worlds or experiencing rapid thoughts. Women are often diagnosed with anxiety or depression instead of ADHD. So the challenges of ADHD can produce anxiety and depression symptoms. However, when these women do get diagnosed with ADHD and they're able to manage it, many times they are able to actually reduce or eliminate their anxiety or depression medication. But the symptoms of ADHD show up at work every single day. You just may not realize it. All right, dyslexia presents in several different ways. It's very unique to each person. Reading difficulty is the most prevalent and probably the most well-known. It can have significant impact on a person's academic and professional success, especially when they're unaware that they have it. They may have difficulty with tasks that require reading, writing, and spelling, and they may also have difficulty with time management, organization, following instructions. So this, of course, can then lead to poor job performance, low self-esteem, and difficulty advancing their careers. So as many as 1 in 5 people are dyslexic, but they are very verbal processors. They're incredibly visual learners. Their symptoms are also experienced on a spectrum, so they can be mild or severe, and it's actually a genetic disorder that really tends to run in families. The next one we'll jump into is autism, and it is a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects how people learn, communicate, behave, and interact with others. It can significantly impact social skills, communication, and self-regulation, but this too is on a spectrum, so there are some that you will find really struggle with social skills and others that do not. It's a very personalized disorder. It affects people very differently and not a one-size-fits-all. You may find that some people with autism struggle to perform standard operating procedures, or they don't always seem like they're being a team player. They might experience challenges with the ability to network or conform to standards, but thankfully these modes and methods are not the only way to provide value. Autism affects about 2.2% of the population, according to the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. And research shows that autistic individuals face higher employment rates and social isolation than some of the other disabilities. But folks with autism are incredibly intelligent. Many of them actually hold multiple degrees with honors and can do amazing work for organizations. So we're going to jump into some of the challenges that we see at work for those who are neurodiverse. And as I mentioned earlier, about 20% of the population is considered neurodiverse. So from a work perspective, you think about 1 in 5 people in your workforce could be neurodiverse. So we really want to dig into some of the challenges that you may experience. And again, this is through the lens of the medical model. So many of the challenges that we're going to go through are perceived as a moral failing instead of this biological makeup of their brain. It just means that they need more support in a world made for those who are neurotypical. Neurodiversity is very nuanced, and therefore misunderstandings of it can lead to damaged careers, relationships. It can evoke large amounts of shame and self-doubt. And at times it can be perceived as people being lazy or lacking willpower, lacking drive. They could appear to be disorganized, undisciplined, or unwilling. I actually worked with a client who was fired from a very high level position, and during the termination conversation she was told, "I have never met anyone who thinks like you." And it was not malice as much as it was just a misunderstanding in how to utilize her talents. So more often than not, the issues and challenges that lead to unemployment, terminations, performance issues are because of lack of understanding. And in addition, those methods, strategies, and procedures are not designed for the neurodiverse brain. It's a similar concept to that of saying if you judge a fish based on its ability to climb a tree, it's going to live its whole life believing it's not smart. So if you judge a neurodiverse person on their ability to perform well using strategies that are not aligned for their brain function, they will believe that they cannot be successful. So we're going to jump into executive functioning. ADHD, dyslexia, autism, they all impact the management system of our brains called executive functioning. The executive functions of our brain take place in the prefrontal cortex, which is right here behind our foreheads. The front of our brains help us with adulting. It's how we navigate our days. It's how we get things done. And so we're actually going to go through 6 executive functions today. There's actually not an agreed set or agreed number of executive function, but these are the ones that are standard to daily functioning. And people who are neurodiverse, as we've mentioned at many different times, they will experience executive functioning symptoms on a continuum, just like they will experience, if it's mild or severe, how they experience those in their daily lives. So one thing a person that may struggle with may not be a struggle for another person. However, folks with ADHD, dyslexia, autism all of them struggle with executive functioning issues. These are all connected, they're all interrelated, and they all influence one another. So they are all entwined. I'm just going to go through each one briefly. Working memory, it's a form of short-term memory that helps us complete our day-to-day tasks, such as taking out the garbage and remembering to replace the bag. Think of it like RAM in your computer, which holds data just long enough to get the current action completed. Emotional regulation is how we control our emotions. Planning and problem solving is what allows us to determine what are the next steps that I need to do to complete a task, and then recognize when there are barriers that might impede our progress. And this also includes time blindness. As a construct, time is different for those who are neurodiverse. Inhibition is when we think before we act, right? So this is a self-control piece. Self-motivation allows us to begin tasks and projects in a timely manner. And then when tasks get difficult or overwhelming, people who are neurodiverse may move on to something else that they find more rewarding. And self-awareness allows us to take a step back, critically analyze our performance in a situation. This is how we shift our behavior and pivot when we're getting less than desired results. So this slide is displaying the different challenges that people may experience in the workplace. It's not indicative of everyone's challenges and experiences. However, these challenges all stem from executive functioning, not a moral failing where they just need to work harder, stop being lazy, or care more. So a few things that I want to note about this, that people can learn skills to compensate for what the prefrontal cortex lacks, but skills are not a cure. Rather, they are a tool to help mitigate the impact of those symptoms that people may be experiencing. So for example, if someone forgets what they said they were going to do, which is a working memory issue, they can actually write things down in the moment. In the moment is key to help them remember. Neuroplasticity is the brain's way of adapting and growing and reorganizing based on the new information it receives. Our brains are fascinating and capable of learning new ways of doing things, and it will learn to do things in different ways to accommodate for those deficits. So this may help someone who's neurodiverse learn new skills to adapt. It's also worth noting that sharing these symptoms does not mean that people who are neurodiverse should get out of doing work or certain projects. All of the issues that you see here can be handled through empathy, through understanding, and a willingness to discover strategies that work for their brain. And many of these strategies can actually be found through accommodations. So did you know that the first typewriter was invented in 1802 by a man who wanted to help his blind sister write letters? And texting was actually an evolution of an earlier technology, TTY, or text telephone. It was created to help people who were deaf communicate as they were not able to converse using regular telephones. And all of the accommodations that you see here on the screen were created for people with disabilities, and yet they have all gone mainstream. And why? Because everyone benefits from them, not just those who are managing disabilities. Curb cutouts, if you're riding a bike, pushing a stroller, you have appreciated those curb cutouts. So accommodations are shifts or changes that we can make to remove barriers to success. So for example, a ramp into a building is accommodation for a wheelchair, but again, if you're pushing a stroller or pushing a cart full of food or whatever the case may be, you may also appreciate having that ramp. These become adaptations. It's how we adapt as a society. Therefore, think of accommodations as a way to help you organize and evolve and transform your organization. It's a concept of universal design where everyone benefits from them regardless of their abilities. So when it comes to accommodating neurodiversity, initially people think it's very daunting. They worry about budget, they worry about intense resources to implement. Do we have to get that IT team involved or whatever the case may be? But there are several accommodations that can be inexpensive, easy to implement. So on this screen, these are just a few examples of what those can be. But the environment where we work has a lot to do with our productivity and the positive outcomes that we're looking for. So actually a quick story. A coaching client of mine recently shared that they used a conference room. They picked up their things, went into a conference room because they had work tasks they just needed to get done. One of which was making phone calls to customers regarding their delinquent payments. There were so many visual and sound distractions that they could not actually focus or concentrate at their desk. However, she was actually written up for working in the conference room. Oftentimes, performance issues are a result of a missed accommodation. And in this case, it was actually a result of misunderstanding why she went into the conference room in the first place. She so badly needed that accommodation to reduce distractions and get her work completed. So leaders, if you are working with a performance issue, consider what may be missing. Here's where we can ask open-ended questions to uncover what might be impeding success in their environment. And when you take the time to understand the challenge from their perspective, problem solving may be a lot easier than you think. So now we're going to shift. So everything that we have described thus far is really from that clinical medical model that we had talked about at the beginning. So we focused on a lot of challenges, and it's really important to understand those because they are real and they are valid, and we don't want to undermine them. And people don't typically go to the doctor or a professional for help because, oh my gosh, things are going great, right? It's because we're struggling and we're looking for help. So these are clinical diagnosis, and the clinical diagnosis focuses on disorder and what is going wrong, which is great for the medical realm. So at work, let's focus on the positive. Let's focus on the strengths and the capabilities instead of the deficits. And it's really important for leaders to understand these challenges so that they can make tweaks to get the best out of the team's brains and their talents. People who are neurodiverse do not need to be fixed. Their brains are designed for innovation and thinking differently. And so we need to focus on strength building, not flaw fixing. So we are going to jump into a strengths-based approach. When we think about our work environments, they're often focused on conforming and complying, right? We have processes to follow, we have procedures, we have protocols. In some cases, we may work for a really highly regulated industry. Our workplaces were born out of this industrial age where tasks were divided up for efficiency's sake. So people were trained to perform specialized tasks. But that led to really repetitive work and lots of processes and procedures to follow, and companies began really training and seeking those specific skills. The workday evolved, right, to our 9 to 5 that we know today, or 8 to 7, or whatever the case may be. However, keep in mind that the neurodiverse population is very unique. They are thinkers, their brains are processing and thinking quickly. They do not always conform and comply. They are going to ask why. They want to understand the value of what they are doing, and if it doesn't make sense, they are going to question it. They are the ones that you want in your workplace to question the status quo. Their brains are connecting dots, they're solving problems, they're thinking three-dimensionally, they're very creative, imaginative. They are the disruptors in your organization. So as thinking differently, that is a desired trait when it's understood and leveraged well. Unfortunately, in many cases, they're thought of as misfits or troublemakers, and sometimes their actions are perceived as an issue with intelligence because they're not conforming and complying. So there are a few hidden gems if you know where to look, right? So the challenge may be that the challenge that might be getting them in trouble could actually be the wiring for their superpower. If there's no discernment where it's possible to really affirm them and tell them they're doing a good job, we could actually be suffocating the very thing that we need to leverage in our companies, not the thing that we think we need to get rid of. So if you see distractibility, they could be a divergent thinker, going rapidly, going from one idea to the next. You may see chaos, but they're thriving in crisis. You see someone who is restless, their mind is coming up with several ideas. You see careless errors in the minutia of things, they might be a higher level thinker. So they are your innovators, they're your strategists. So perhaps they're actually not in the right seat or the right role that you can leverage their strengths. But when we focus on strengths and not flaw fixing, they don't need to be fixed. They need to be better utilized. So oftentimes, those people who are under the neurodiversity umbrella, they have higher intelligence. They have incredibly unique skills, such as the ability to spot patterns. They can make connections between very seemingly unrelated things. They're great at spatial reasoning and awareness, problem solving, creative thinking. They're highly imaginative, big picture thinking, high level of empathy. So people who are neurodiverse they're accountable, they're reliable, they're efficient. They do not need to be micromanaged. They do not need to be given special treatment to get out of doing their work. Their neurodiversity is an explanation, not an excuse. It's not a reason to expect less, but rather to discover more. So find out what lights them up, and then they will do some really amazing work. So they're fully capable. They should be held accountable. And when they're in the right environment with the strategies and support, they can really do their best work. So often referred to as scaffolding, these types of supports can be helpful in a lot of different ways. And keep in mind, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is a sampling of what support can look like. It's also worth noting these are all universal design support. So I mentioned universal design on the accommodation side, where I talked about adaptations that work well for all. So while these supports are really imperative for people who are neurodiverse, they are also very important to everyone. And there are many people who would really appreciate and benefit from all of these. They're not just check boxes. Think of it more as like a la carte menu. It's mixing and matching to find the right approach for each unique individual. So for example, coaching is one of the most effective modalities for people who are neurodiverse. Side note, I would also add it's incredibly helpful when their leader also participates in separate coaching sessions. But if you pair coaching with exercise, exercise activates executive functioning in the brain, and it kicks focus and attention into action. It improves working memory, problem solving, and planning. It boosts mood, it boosts confidence. So keep in mind, it does not mean you have to go out and run a marathon. You can take a brisk walk after lunch or do a quick set of jumping jacks and some knee lifts, for example. But movement in any form is highly impactful for those who are neurodiverse. So in combination, these can be very effective, impactful when dealing with some of the complexities in the workplace. So strengths through difference. So when we look at this list, it contains many traits, skills, competencies that companies and leaders are seeking for their workforce. And each one of these strengths is inherent to the neurodiverse mind. It's part of their DNA, it's who they are. Their cognitive abilities have many skills that serve them well. And what we focus on grows. What we focus on tends to be what we see. So in other words, when we focus on a deficit model, we're going to miss many of the strengths that could be leveraged at work. When we reframe the challenges and look to the strengths, then we have something to leverage and actually act upon. So one question that I want you to take away with you today is, how well do you know the strengths of the people on your team, the people that you are working with on a daily basis? Where do they shine? 92% of HR executives agree that people managers are critical for the overall success of their organization, and it is more important than ever to ensure leaders have the proper skill set to lead others, including those who are neurodiverse. It does take a skill set to understand that. Leaders focusing on strengths is a game changer. Understanding unique abilities and gifts is how you can leverage them for the future. Neurodiversity is nuanced, and so is being a human. Ensuring leaders are prepared to navigate some of those challenges of leading people, it's critical for the overall success of an organization and the employee experience. This is how we retain really great talent. In a recent study by JP Morgan, which is a company with very strong neurodiversity programs, it found autistic people are 48% faster at completing work and 140% more productive than the neurotypical folks. Autistic people can see gaps and risks that others cannot see. They shared a story in a report recently that said they had a JP Morgan employee who proved that she could see gaps because she noticed the risk posed by, there was an electric vehicle charging station near one of their branches. These EV stations are actually very prone to hackers, and so it wasn't long after she identified the risk and it was mitigated that EV station was indeed hacked. But thankfully JP Morgan's data was not. They also shared a case study of a mostly nonverbal autistic man who was hired into an apprenticeship program, and later he was hired full-time. He completed projects in record time. What they thought would take over a year only took him 6 months, and he did it completely error-free. So how do we master the art of acquiring neurodiverse talent? So let's talk a moment about culture fit. It's become the norm for companies to hire for culture fit. However, they run the risk of creating an environment prone to groupthink. Cognitive diversity is really key to driving creativity and innovation in organizations. So ask yourself, what mental models, how we understand and believe the world to work, what mental models are preventing us from hiring people who are neurodiverse and getting them into our workforce? So think about interviewing. When you're interviewing, do you expect a strong handshake and eye contact? Are you expecting a smile and a pleasant greeting, or do you want them to be personable and likable? We unintentionally overlook talent when we see behaviors as quirky or weird. And so what if the most amazing talent is right in front of you, but it's just disguised? So instead of culture fit, where we're all the same, think of it as, how do we expand the culture? How do we broaden it so that we can include different perspectives? Companies who learn to master the art of acquiring neurodiverse talent and learn to leverage the neurodiversity strengths benefit from higher innovations, from creativity in the products that they take to market. They experience increases in productivity for their workforce, their reputation and values increase. You will get very loyal following. If a company is loyal to those who are neurodiverse, they will reciprocate that. And therefore, these companies that are finding themselves with higher financial returns and revenue increases as much as 19%. So we need leaders and companies to really cultivate the talent to leverage the strengths. We need to be patient when others are perceived as being annoying or too much or too passionate or too excited, too much energy, too weird, too quiet. Consider that in that moment, there may be a genius in front of you. Building awareness and understanding of neurodiversity is a really great first step to build acceptance and empathy. These unlock the keys to understanding their strengths and leveraging their skills and talents, which propels companies towards innovation. As I mentioned in the beginning, innovation, leadership, neurodiversity, they're all very interrelated and connected. And when leaders understand how to leverage neurodiversity, it can drive innovation in an organization, leading to some really amazing transformations. So thank you so much for attending today. I am now going to turn it over to Johanna to cover any questions that we may have had in the chat.
Well, thank you, Gina. This was very interesting, and so far there is one question, and I'll give it to you and for you to think about while I go through the next couple of slides that are related to EAP benefits. But someone is wondering if you have other resources you can recommend to leaders and how they can coach and work better with neurodiverse team members. So while you think about your answer to that, I'm going to share information about the EAP slide, which I think should be the next slide if I remembered to include it.
Yep.
When there we go. Okay. So first of all, this was a great conversation. Gina is available to take questions. I will read them from the chat. And oh, they're coming in. They're coming in. Okay. So just real quickly, I know a lot of you have attended our webinars in the past, but most likely you have EFR's EAP benefits and you have access to 24/7 phone support at this 800 number listed, as do anyone in your household. So just keep in mind that we are here to help support you through whatever you're going through. We say life happens, we're here to help. There are so many great resources to tap into through your EAP benefit. The next slide goes through what some of those resources are. It's more than counseling, it's more than life coaching. We have financial consultation, we have specialized first responder life coaching, we have elder and child care benefits, identity theft, we have an online peer support platform called Together All. So lots of great information available on our website at efr.org. And again, call that 800 number at any time. So I'm going to just jump into these questions because I want to make sure we get to them. So the first one, Gina, was resources for leaders who want to, work better and help coach their team members who are neurodiverse.
Yeah, so I do have some resources right now. I have one on how to have difficult conversations or very important conversations with people who are neurodiverse. I have those on my website. So they can go out there and get those. I also have some videos that leaders can watch as well. But yeah, we can help leaders really understand what some of that nuance is. And really at the end of the day, for leaders, it's not that they have to have this new skill set to handle neurodiversity. It's actually a lot of the things that we are familiar with when it comes to leader. It's empathy, it's psychological safety. It's really understanding what some of the human experience elements are. And so it's deep listening and active listening. I will say that the neurodiverse community has gotten very used to not being listened to. We share something and it's like, oh, well, try harder, whatever the case may be. And so I think people shut down and they don't tend to share. So when leaders are really good about really listening deeply and hearing the story within their story, that can be incredibly impactful. And empathy, understanding that they are going to have some struggles, and then also just being open to doing things in different ways, right? So if there is a process and procedure and you have to follow it, well, be open to hearing a different perspective, because that's where some of the innovation and some of the continuous improvement can happen when people are open to hearing how shifts can be made. But it's also how we conduct our team meetings and how we engage with people, and really taking some moments to stop and listen and engage differently. If people would like to know more beyond that, I think they can reach out to the account managers with EFR and get additional information for how we can get in touch with one another.
How can neurodiverse employees protect themselves in the workplace, or how can they successfully request an accommodation?
So you can actually ask for accommodations without disclosing that you are neurodiverse. But some people start with their leaders. When I was diagnosed, I started with my leader and had a conversation. What do you need? The thing that I realized though is that I wasn't able to articulate my needs because I wasn't even sure what they were. And so it was a process of just uncovering that for myself and then continuing to have those conversations with my leader. And then I did reach out to HR as well, just to be able to have the conversation with them and what do I need to know from that standpoint. But you still don't actually have to disclose your neurodiverse diagnosis if you do not want to. People who have disclosed have actually had some issues with that from a stigma standpoint, but accommodations like noise canceling headphones, some of the things that we talked about, asking for quiet or less distracted areas, lighting. If lighting can actually be dimmed or brightened, that can be very helpful. People who are neurodiverse have a lot of sensory issues, right? So it's distraction, it's smell, it could be a lot of different things. And so, you know, having a conversation with HR about, can we implement a policy to use, you know, non-fragranced, so people will not use, you know, strong fragranced perfumes or lotions or things like that. And I know there are actually several companies who have implemented those types of policies. But accommodations can really just be a conversation with a leader without having to disclose, but it's really personal preference for that individual employee.
Thank you. Do you have any tools that you can give employees to share with their leaders to help advocate for themselves?
That is something that we do have in a toolkit that we are developing, and a toolkit that we actually will have for not only the people who are neurodiverse, but for leaders that they can use on how to do those types of things. So again, that's something where if people want to learn more about that, they can reach out to their EFR account manager, and then we can get in touch that way.
Yeah, and for those of you on the call today, I would imagine that several of you are not necessarily our primary contact. So at EFR, you know, we provide EAP benefits to a workplace or organization, and typically we have one or two primary contacts, meaning our account management team will connect with maybe your HR director or someone in your benefits department, and we will work with them to schedule trainings and to make sure that you have all the information you need to promote the EAP benefits. So if you're on this call and you're not our primary contact, but you're wondering, gosh, I would really love to have Gina come on behalf of EFR and do neurodiversity training in the workplace, maybe reach out to your HR director and say, hey, I attended this webinar and I'm wondering if you could reach out to EFR for me and try to coordinate this. So that's, for those of you who don't know what an account manager does, it's the liaison between EFR and your organization. We have a couple questions about, is this being recorded? The answer is yes, it's being recorded and it will be on our website, efr.org, probably by this afternoon. So check that out. We have a question, what type of provider would you want to see for a potential diagnosis?
Yeah, so you're not going to actually go to a general practitioner for this. It actually is going to take a little bit deeper expertise in neurodiversity. So there are neuropsychologists that you can go to, or a psychologist, and there are several around Iowa. Some are virtual, but it is actually a somewhat lengthy process, just because they have to really look into, okay, why now? So for example, for me, I was diagnosed in 2020. I didn't realize a lot of the symptoms I had earlier in my life, and how they were actually ADHD symptoms. But for me in 2020, you know, it's the pandemic, and at the time I had a 1-year-old. So I had a 1-year-old, I had a 3-year-old, I had a 6-year-old, and it was, you know, it was hard with all the daycare challenges of, you know, they had to quarantine and all the things, plus I'm trying to work from home and I had a kindergartner at home. So there were so many things that I was just struggling. And so for me, it was reaching out and having that conversation with a psychologist to say, yep, this is something where, why now? Because I was able to handle it, but now I don't have the skills to do some of the things that I need to do successfully. And so they're going to ask those types of questions. And then the diagnostic criteria is used, the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual, is what they use, what all providers use to actually get to that diagnostic criteria. And so they will go through and do some tests as well. It's usually about a 3-hour test to get that done. You typically have to have a diagnosis. Well, you do have to have a diagnosis in order to access medication, but there are several other resources that you do not need a diagnosis to access. So if you are looking for that, you can actually talk to your provider, your primary provider, if you want to actually get some recommendations. Otherwise, you can go to a psychologist, neuropsychologist, or a psychiatrist for those types of services.
Thank you. And just to clarify, your EAP benefit, that would not be able to do any kind of diagnostic or testing. That is outside of the scope of EAP. One person has just a question about, you use the term people manager, and could you just clarify what you mean by that? I'm assuming you mean leader or
Yep.
manager.
Yeah, so people manager being anyone who has a direct report. And I think it's really important for people managers to really understand the nuance and be educated on that, so that they can use that knowledge as they're navigating the day-to-day with their people and their teams.
We have someone sharing that they were recently diagnosed with autism as an adult. How do I navigate communicating this to my supervisor? I'd like to disclose to them to give some context around my behaviors, but I do worry about stigma.
Yeah, it's a really difficult challenge. And I think that that's something where it is a very personalized journey for that. If you feel like you have a very good a very good relationship, a strong relationship, if you feel like you have psychological safety with your leader and can have that conversation and you feel comfortable doing so, then yes, I would, I think talking to the leader is a really great first step. And then you can start to do things, and you can either do it in a very casual way where you just say, well, we'll just go through it, and as we run into things, then we can address them as we come into it, or you can list out, here are some of my significant challenges, here are some accommodations that we might need to consider if the leader is open to those. And so I think one of the things that people with neurodiversity do really well is follow their intuition and follow their gut. And so I would say what feels good for you in the moment when you're having those conversations is really listen to your gut when you're having that. But again, however your brain processes, if you want to do that in a very, laid out way where it's very particular in how we're going to identify all of these things, or you want it to be more casual, you can choose what that adventure looks like as far as having those conversations.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions and then we'll wrap this up. The next question is a neurodivergent diagnosis considered a disability?
It depends on how it impacts you. So if your symptoms are mild, then typically it's not considered debilitating or disability. If your symptoms are very severe and you have incredible challenges, then yes, it may be something that you will be considered a disability and then covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA covers a lot of really wonderful things and a lot of protections for those who do have disabilities, and it's a really great piece of legislation. However, if you have ADHD and your symptoms are mild, you may not actually be covered on some of the ADA things, but it just depends on where you fit on that continuum and on that scale of mild to severe.
All right, thank you. And then we do have a question about your website, since you mentioned you have a couple, I think, resources and assessments there. If you could say it, and then I'm going to enter it in the chat so people can actually read it.
Yeah, so if they go to www.magnifyinnovationgroup.com, we have several resources out there, and actually it's ever growing, so we're continuing to add them out there. We do have a neuropsychologist on our team, however, she's only licensed in Minnesota, so you would actually have to travel to Minnesota if you were interested in getting a diagnosis, but there are other resources out there available for you to peruse and look through.
All right, well, thank you so much, Gina. This was so informative. And like we mentioned, we do have, I believe it's a 2-hour training called Neurodiversity in the Workplace that you can have on behalf of EFR, and Gina is a facilitator for that. She can deliver that virtually to your workplace, or depending on where you are located, potentially in person. And again, that would be coordinated through your account manager at EFR. So if you're on this call and you're not someone who's in direct contact with the EFR account manager, like I said, it's usually someone in HR or someone in benefits that would be able to connect the dots for you there. But thank you so much. Don't forget, you have access to your EAP benefits by calling the 800 number, and we will have a 2025 webinar series. The first one will be in February, and we'll do them quarterly thereafter. Those will be posted to the website sometime in the next couple of weeks, so I look forward to seeing everyone back in 2025. Thank you, Gina.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. Have a great day, everyone.